I can still hear his words, clear as if they were carved into the walls of this old house. You're just a burden here. That's what my only son told me just a few nights ago. It's strange, isn't it? How a single sentence can cut deeper than years of silence. I've lived nearly 80 years on this earth, and I've weathered storms you couldn't imagine. But those 6 words, they shattered me in ways no hardship ever had. I'm sitting here now, at my kitchen table. The clock ticks louder than it should, the air feels colder than it is, and the walls, these walls I worked so hard to build, seem to press in closer with every second. My hands are trembling as I hold this photograph. It's an old picture, worn at the edges, almost faded with time. In it, my son is only 5 years old, missing a front tooth, smiling wide with ice cream smeared on his cheeks. I can still remember the heat of that Texas afternoon, the smell of fried chicken cooling on the counter, and his little voice calling, "Mama, look at me." Back then, I thought those moments would last forever. Back then, I thought my love, my sacrifices, would be enough to carry us through anything. But tonight, this picture feels like a cruel reminder of what used to be. A life full of laughter and promise, now replaced by silence and distance. I placed the photo flat on the table and rested my hand over it, almost as if by covering it I could hide from the truth. But no, truth has a way of burning itself into you, whether you look it in the eye or not. You know, there's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. The kind I'm living in now feels like a heavy fog. It smothers every thought, every breath. I can hear the refrigerator hum. I can hear the wind brushing against the window. But under all of that, I hear his voice. You're just a burden. How does a son look his mother in the eye and say that? I keep asking myself, where did I go wrong? Did I love too much? Did I expect too much? Did I hold on too tightly? My heart tells me no, that all I ever wanted was for him to have the life I never did. But my mind tortures me with questions that don't have answers. It wasn't always like this. My story didn't begin with cruelty. It began with sacrifice, with devotion, with love so fierce it kept me alive when I thought I couldn't go on. And maybe that's why this pain feels unbearable, because it isn't just about words spoken in anger. It's about the years behind them. Years that built this home, that shaped my son, that carried us through nights when the pantry was empty and mornings when I stitched old clothes to make them last another season. I want to tell you something. Betrayal doesn't always come like a lightning strike. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, like a shadow moving across your life. You don't notice it at first. You tell yourself it's nothing, that things will be fine. And then one day, you wake up and realize the light is gone, and all you're left with is darkness. That's where I am now. But before I tell you how I reached this breaking point, you need to understand the road that led here. You need to know the woman I was, the life I lived, the love I poured out like water into a thirsty ground. Because this didn't happen overnight. No, this was years in the making. I take a deep breath, close my eyes, and the past pulls me back like an old song I can't forget. The taste of cornbread, the sound of cicadas on hot Texas nights, the feel of my son's small hand in mine. This story isn't easy for me to tell. It's raw, it's painful, but it's also the truth. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear it. Maybe another mother sitting alone tonight, holding her own photograph, will know she's not alone. So listen closely, because this is not just the story of one old woman. It's the story of every sacrifice a mother makes, every dream she tucks away for the sake of her child, and the heartbreak that comes when that love is forgotten. This is my story, and it begins long before that cruel sentence was spoken. It begins in the dusty backroads of Texas, in the small rented house where I first learned how heavy love could be, and how much it could cost. I wasn't always this old woman sitting at a quiet kitchen table. Once, I was a young girl with dreams too big for my little Texas town. I wanted to travel, to study, to maybe even become a teacher. But life had its own plans for me. I married young, far too young, if I'm being honest. Back then, girls weren't told to chase dreams. We were told to find a husband, start a family, and keep the house running. And I tried. Lord knows I tried. But marriage wasn't what I imagined it would be. My husband had a restless spirit, the kind that never settles. He worked when he felt like it, drank more than he should, and disappeared for days at a time. When my boy was born, I thought maybe things would change. I thought his father would see that little face, those tiny hands, and finally become the man I needed him to be. But instead, he drifted further away until one day he just didn't come back. And so it was me. Just me and my baby boy. Those early years were hard, harder than I can even explain. There were nights I cried myself to sleep. Not because I was lonely, but because I didn't know how I'd keep a roof over our heads. I worked wherever I could, cleaning houses, waiting tables, stitching clothes for neighbors. My hands were always raw from scrubbing floors, my back always aching. But I never let my boy see my weakness. I remember standing in line at the grocery store with a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk, praying the few dollars in my purse would stretch far enough. Sometimes it didn't, and I'd put something back. But somehow, I always made sure he ate. If I had to skip a meal, so be it. That little boy was my reason for everything. I still remember his laugh, high-pitched, pure, like music. It could erase a whole day's worth of exhaustion. He loved to run through the sprinklers in the yard, barefoot, mud splattering his shorts, yelling, "Mama, look! I'm flying!" And I'd smile through my tiredness, clap my hands, and pretend to believe him. People used to say I spoiled him. Maybe I did. But when you've got so little, you hold on to the joy you can create. For him, I wanted the world, even if all I could give him was a second-hand toy truck from the thrift store, polished until it shone like new. Every sacrifice I made with love. There was a time I wanted to go back to school. I even enrolled in night classes once. I sat in that classroom with my notebook, feeling proud, thinking maybe I'd finally do something for myself. But after a week, I dropped out. My boy had gotten sick, and I couldn't leave him with the neighbor again. He needed me more than I needed that diploma. And so I let go of my dream, without bitterness, without regret. That was motherhood to me, choosing him, always him. Years passed, and little by little, things got better. I saved every extra penny, tucked it into a jar I kept hidden in the pantry behind the flour. Some weeks I added only quarters, some weeks a few dollars. But over 20 years, that jar grew. Piece by piece, I built a dream I didn't think possible. And one day, I bought this house. It wasn't fancy, just a small, sturdy home with creaking wooden floors, chipped paint, and a yard that needed more love than I had to give. But it was ours. My hands built this home, not by laying bricks, but by paying every bill, patching every leak, painting every wall. I scrubbed these floors until they shone. I planted roses by the porch so my boy would smell sweetness when he came home from school. This house became more than shelter. It was my proof that sacrifice, patience, and faith could create something lasting. When I stood in that empty living room the first night, my boy only 14 years old, I told him, "This is your home, son. This is where you'll always belong." And I meant it with every fiber of my being. He grew up within these walls. I can still hear his teenage footsteps pounding down the hall, the slam of his bedroom door when we argued, the low hum of music from his radio late at night. And I loved even those sounds, because they meant he was safe under my roof. I was proud of the man he was becoming. He was smart, ambitious, and I thought, respectful. I thought I'd raised him right. When he graduated high school, I sat in the audience with tears streaming down my face. I clapped so hard my hands hurt. Every blister, every skipped meal, every lonely night felt worth it in that moment. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. As he grew older, I noticed little changes. He called me less. He spent more time with his friends, and later, with the woman who would become his wife. That's natural, I told myself. Every boy grows up, every man starts his own life. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I felt a pang of fear. Was I losing him? I brushed it aside. I didn't want to believe it. When he came to visit, I made his favorite meals: chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, peach cobbler. I wanted him to feel this house was still his. He would smile, eat, and say, "Thanks, Mom." But soon enough, he'd be checking his phone, itching to leave. I told myself he was just busy. That's what I always said, he's just busy. But a mother knows when the distance isn't just physical. A mother feels it deep down, like a crack forming in the foundation of a home. And though I tried to ignore it, I knew the ground was shifting beneath us. Still, I held on. Still, I gave. Because that's what mothers do. We keep giving, even when it hurts. Looking back now, I realize my sacrifices built not only this house, but also a kind of blindness. I believed that love, given freely, would always come back. I believed that every meal cooked, every shirt ironed, every prayer whispered for his safety would add up to loyalty, gratitude, respect. But love doesn't always return the way you think it will. Sometimes it's dismissed. Sometimes it's forgotten. And that's why the words he spoke cut me so deeply. Because they didn't just come from a moment of anger. They came from a lifetime of forgetting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, I want you to see me as I was, a mother who built her life around her son. Who gave and gave, until there was nothing left of the young girl with dreams. Only a woman with calloused hands, tired eyes, and a heart full of pride for her boy. Because only then will you understand how devastating it was to hear him say I was nothing more than a burden. Only then will you feel the weight of the betrayal that was waiting just around the corner. When my son first told me he was in love, my heart swelled with joy. I can still remember that day. He came home with a grin on his face, the kind I hadn't seen since he was a boy running through sprinklers in the summer. He sat at this very kitchen table, fidgeting with his hands like he didn't know how to put his feelings into words. And then he said, "Mom, I met someone." The way he said her name, soft, careful, almost reverent, told me he was serious. I leaned forward, eager to hear more. I wanted to know everything, what she liked, where she came from, what made her laugh. He told me she was kind, beautiful, and smart. And I smiled, because all I ever wanted was for him to find love, the kind of love I never had. When he finally brought her home to meet me, I was nervous. I cooked a big dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and my peach cobbler for dessert. I wore my nicest dress, pressed my hair, and made sure the house smelled of cinnamon and comfort. I wanted her to feel welcomed, to feel that this house was as much hers as it was mine. She was polite, soft-spoken, with a smile that seemed warm enough at first. But there was something in her eyes, something that made me feel as though she were looking through me, not at me. I brushed it aside. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too protective of my boy. After all, every new relationship takes adjustment. But as months turned into years, I began to notice the small cracks. At first, it was subtle. My son would cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "Mom, you wouldn't understand." Or if I offered advice, he'd sigh and say, "Times are different now, Mom. Things aren't the way they were when you were raising me." His wife, my daughter-in-law, rarely said much directly, but her silence spoke volumes. She didn't ask me for recipes, didn't linger to talk, didn't seek the kind of bond one had dreamed of having with a daughter-in-law. Sometimes, when I entered a room, I felt the conversation hush, like I'd walked into a space where I wasn't welcome. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself they are just busy with their own lives. But the truth was harder to ignore. When my son married, I was happy. I sat in the front row of that little church, tears blurring my vision, my heart full of pride. I prayed that she would love him the way I did, that she would honor the sacrifices that had raised him. After the wedding, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to meddle. I knew what people said about mothers-in-law, and I didn't want to become that stereotype. I gave them space, respected their home, and reminded myself that my role was changing. But no matter how much space I gave, the distance only grew. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became fewer. When they did visit, my son's eyes were always on the clock, as if he had somewhere more important to be. I'd prepare his favorite meals, but now he'd push the food around his plate, distracted by his phone. His wife would sit stiffly, polite but cold, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I tried harder. I baked pies for them, knitted blankets for their home, slipped $20 bills into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking. I thought if I just kept giving, he would see. He would remember. But giving turned into taking, and taking turned into expectation. It was around that time that my health started to waver. Age has a way of creeping in slowly. One day you're strong enough to carry groceries, the next you're winded just climbing the stairs. My son began to notice, and one evening he said, "Mom, you should think about signing the house over to me. That way, you'll never have to worry. We'll take care of you." I looked into his eyes and saw the boy I had raised, the boy I trusted with every piece of my heart. And without hesitation, I agreed. I signed the deed, thinking I was securing my future, thinking I was giving him a gift, a legacy. This house had been my life's work, and handing it to him felt like a mother's final blessing. I didn't know then that I had just planted the seed of my own betrayal. At first, nothing seemed different. I still lived here, still sat at this table, still walked through rooms filled with memories. But slowly, the air changed. My son began to refer to it as his house. Not ours. His. If I suggested repainting a wall or fixing a broken step, he'd brush me off. "It's fine, Mom. I'll decide what to do." If I tried to cook in my own kitchen, I felt the tension rise, like I was intruding. Sometimes his wife would whisper just loud enough for me to hear, "She's always in the way." Those words stung, but I swallowed them. I told myself not to cause trouble. I told myself, he'll come around. He's just busy. But the shadows kept growing. There were moments when my son looked at me not with love, but with something colder, impatience, maybe even annoyance. Once, when I asked if he could drive me to the doctor, he sighed and said, "Mom, do you really need to go? You know I've got a lot going on." I remember sitting in the passenger seat that day, hands folded tightly in my lap, staring out the window at the passing fields. I wanted to cry, but I forced the tears back. Mothers aren't supposed to be a burden. Mothers are supposed to be strong. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I felt the truth pressing against me. I was becoming invisible in my own son's eyes. The worst part was the small humiliations, the little things that built up like drops of water wearing down stone. I'd overhear them whispering in the kitchen about money, about how things would be easier if Mom didn't need so much. I'd see the glance exchanged between them when I forgot something or moved too slowly. And though no one said it aloud at first, the message was clear. I was no longer an anchor in his life. I was a weight dragging him down. I think, in my heart, I knew where it was leading. But knowing doesn't make the blow hurt any less. The night he finally said it, "You're just a burden here." I felt the years of small betrayals crystallize into one sharp truth. That sentence didn't come from nowhere. It was the echo of every sigh, every dismissal, every cold glance that had piled up over the years. And in that moment, sitting at this table, I realized that the son I had raised with every ounce of my being no longer saw me as his mother. He saw me as an inconvenience. I still remember the exact moment, the very second my heart cracked open and refused to heal. It was late evening. The house was unusually quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. My son and his wife had just come home from a gathering, and I was sitting in the living room, folding a basket of clothes. I had gotten used to keeping my hands busy. It gave me a sense of belonging, of usefulness. But that night, something changed forever. He walked in, his face tight with irritation, his wife trailing behind him with that familiar look in her eyes, the one that said I was in the way. I tried to smile, tried to lighten the mood, but before I could say much, he snapped. "Mom," he said sharply, "you're just a burden here. Just a burden." Those 3 words echoed in my ears like a storm breaking inside my chest. I froze, the shirt I was folding slipping from my hands. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Surely, the little boy I raised, the one whose fevered forehead I kissed through countless nights, the one whose shoes I mended because we couldn't afford new ones, the one whose future I poured every ounce of my soul into, surely, that boy could never say this. But he did. And he meant it. I wanted to ask him, a burden? After everything I gave? After every sacrifice I made? But the words never left my lips. My throat closed up, my chest tightened, and I just stood there, stunned. His wife said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was agreement enough. I quietly picked up the shirt that had fallen, placed it back into the basket, and walked away. I didn't slam a door, didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I just disappeared into the shadows of my own home. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the small wooden chest I kept by my side. Inside it were little treasures of a life that had once been full of meaning. My son's first baby blanket, a pair of his worn-out sneakers from when he was in middle school, a dried flower he once picked for me when we couldn't afford a birthday gift. I pulled them out one by one, holding them in my trembling hands, remembering the warmth of a time when I was his world. And now, to him, I was nothing more than a weight to carry. Tears fell, uninvited, rolling silently down my cheeks. I pressed that tiny baby blanket to my chest and whispered, I gave up my life for you, and now I don't even have a place in yours. The days that followed were colder than any winter I had ever known. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to make too much noise, careful not to take up space. I stopped cooking the meals I used to prepare with love. I stopped humming to myself while folding laundry. I stopped speaking at the dinner table unless someone asked me something directly, which rarely happened anymore. It was as if his words had sealed my lips. I began to notice things I had ignored before. The way his wife would sigh when I entered the room, the way my son would avoid eye contact, the way conversations would halt the moment I walked in. I was no longer a mother in this house. I was an intruder. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. She's always around, his wife said, her voice low but sharp. We can't live our lives freely with her here. And his reply? A tired sigh. I know, but what can we do? She gave me the house. She has nowhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. Those words cut almost as deep as burden. Because they were true. I had nowhere else. My entire life was poured into this home, into this family. I never thought I'd need a backup plan. My son was supposed to be my plan. I walked back to my room and closed the door. My hands shook as I touched the family photo on my nightstand, the one where he was just a little boy sitting on my lap, both of us smiling at the camera like the world belonged to us. I traced his tiny face in that photograph with my finger, and I whispered to myself, where did I lose you? Nights became unbearable. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying my life like an old film reel. I remembered nights when he was small, burning with fever, and I sat by his bedside with a wet cloth, praying, begging God not to take him from me. I remembered the afternoons I skipped meals so he could eat, telling him I wasn't hungry while my stomach twisted in pain. I remembered dreams I once had, traveling, learning, maybe even finding love again. But I had let all of it go, because raising him was enough for me. Every memory now mocked me. Had it all been for nothing? Was motherhood just a one-sided love story, where the mother gives everything and the child forgets? I found myself talking less, retreating more. My world shrank to the four walls of my room. Even the house I had once been so proud of, no longer felt like mine. It was theirs. I was a shadow haunting the corners. The breaking point wasn't just that one night he called me a burden. It was the slow erosion of love, the quiet, daily humiliations that followed. The way laughter filled the living room but died down when I walked in. The way decisions were made without me, even though it was once my home. I began to eat alone. Sometimes I waited until everyone had gone to bed, sneaking into the kitchen to warm up leftovers so I wouldn't have to feel those eyes on me. Sometimes I didn't eat at all. Hunger became easier than the ache of rejection. I kept my little wooden chest close, opening it often, holding onto those scraps of memory like they were the only proof I had ever mattered to him. And yet, a small, foolish part of me still hoped. Still prayed that one morning, he'd knock on my door, sit beside me, and say, Mom, I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. You mean the world to me. But that morning never came. Instead, each day pushed me further into silence, until my voice itself felt like a burden. And that, dear listener, is when I realized the truth. Betrayal doesn't always come in one sudden strike. Sometimes, it comes like slow poison, word by word, action by action, silence by silence, until you no longer recognize the love you once lived for. That was the night, and the days after, when my heart truly shattered. Not into pieces that could be mended, but into dust that the wind scattered across a house that no longer felt like home. I wish I could tell you that the storm passed quickly, that the words my son threw at me were washed away by time and healing. But the truth is, they stayed. They stayed in the walls of the house, in the way silence grew thicker, in the way my footsteps sounded louder on the wooden floor because no one cared to answer them anymore. After that argument, the one where he said I was just a burden, I shrank into myself. I no longer knew where I belonged in my own home. I moved like a shadow, carefully, quietly, as though afraid of disturbing anyone. Sometimes I would catch myself tiptoeing to the kitchen, just so I wouldn't hear the sighs of annoyance from the other room. Meals became a silent ritual. I used to love setting the table, laying out dishes the way my mother had taught me, with pride, with love. But now, I ate alone most nights. A small plate, a spoon, maybe a cup of tea. I would sit at the corner of the dining table while the rest of the family ate together, laughter filling the air. Laughter I was no longer invited into. The hardest part was not the food, not the loneliness, but the way they avoided my eyes. My son, the same boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, who once clung to my sari when thunder frightened him, now could not bear to meet my gaze for more than a moment. His wife spoke to me only when necessary, her voice clipped, polite, distant, like I was some distant relative overstaying her welcome. I started spending most of my time in my room. For walls, a small window, and my prayer beads became my world. The house outside that room no longer felt like mine. It was as though the deed I had signed over had erased not just my ownership, but my existence. But you see, memories are cruel companions. When I closed my eyes, I didn't just see the loneliness of the present, I saw flashes of the past. I saw my son as a boy, running barefoot in the courtyard, his laughter echoing like music. I saw myself in the kitchen, kneading dough with hands that trembled from exhaustion but never stopped because he needed to eat. I saw the nights I stayed awake when his fever burned, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering prayers with every breath. And then I would open my eyes, and there he was, grown, successful, surrounded by his own family, but unable to see me. The contrast tore me apart. How could the same child who once looked at me as though I was his whole world now treat me as though I were nothing? I began to question myself. Was I wrong to sacrifice so much? Did I fail somewhere along the way? Was love supposed to end like this, with silence, with rejection, with the word burden echoing in my ears? Some nights, I would sit by the window, looking out at the streetlights glowing in the distance. I would whisper into the night, asking God why my heart had to carry this weight. Why the home I built brick by brick with my love had turned into a place where I felt invisible. Family gatherings were the worst. On holidays, relatives would visit. The house would be filled with laughter, plates clattering, children running around. And I would sit there, on the edge of the sofa, smiling when spoken to, nodding when someone asked me a question. But inside, I felt like a ghost. Present, but unseen. Sometimes, I caught the children looking at me curiously, as though trying to understand why their grandmother was always so quiet, why she rarely joined in the games. They didn't know that their laughter reminded me of another time, a time when their father was small, when my world was bright and full of meaning. And then came the day that broke me completely. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was walking past the living room when I heard my son and his wife talking. Their voices were low, but the words pierced me like knives. "She's getting too difficult," his wife said. There was a pause. Then my son's voice, steady, almost indifferent. "I know. We'll have to make arrangements soon. Maybe a facility. Or we can sell the house and find something smaller for ourselves." I froze. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my back against the wall, my hands trembling as though the ground had disappeared beneath me. A facility. Sell the house. As though I was an object to be moved, an obstacle to be cleared. Do you know what it feels like to hear your child, the one you raised, the one you built your life around, talk about discarding you like unwanted furniture? It is a pain that has no language, a silence that crushes the soul. I didn't cry at that moment. No, the tears came later, in the stillness of my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the photo album I had kept all these years. Pictures of his first birthday, his first school uniform, his wedding day. I traced his smile with my finger, wondering how that boy became this man. I asked myself if all my sacrifices had been meaningless. The years of hunger, the nights without sleep, the dreams I gave up so he could chase his own. Had it all been for nothing? In those days, despair became my shadow. I ate less, spoke less, smiled almost never. Even my prayers felt heavy. I wondered if God had turned his face from me too. But in the darkest of nights, something began to stir within me. Perhaps it was the stubbornness of a mother's heart, or perhaps it was faith refusing to die. One evening, as I sat with my prayer beads, I realized I may have signed that deed, but I had not signed away my dignity. I remembered the day I handed him the papers. I did it with love, with trust. But trust, once broken, can be reclaimed, not through anger, but through quiet strength. That night, I made a decision. I would not be discarded. I would not allow my life, my home, my sacrifices to be erased. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to stand again. For myself. For the woman who once carried the world in her arms. The despair did not vanish overnight. But in that decision, I felt a flicker of something I thought I had lost forever, strength. And that small flame was enough to guide me toward the next chapter of my life. I remember the night after I overheard their cruel conversation, the one where they spoke of sending me away, as if I were just a piece of old furniture that no longer belonged in their home. My heart had shattered into so many pieces, I thought it would never be whole again. But that night, as I sat alone in my room, with only the dim glow of a small lamp and the quiet ticking of the clock, something stirred deep inside me. It wasn't anger. No, I was too tired for anger. It wasn't revenge either. I have lived too many years to waste the last of my strength on bitterness. What I felt, sitting there with my prayer beads in my hand, was something quieter, something steadier, a whisper of strength that I hadn't felt in years. I closed my eyes and thought about the woman I once was. The young girl who left her parents' home with dreams in her heart. The young wife who built a life brick by brick beside her husband. The mother who gave up everything to see her son smile. That woman wasn't weak. She was strong. And if I survived all of that, why couldn't I survive this? For days, I moved through the house with a kind of stillness. I cooked when I was asked. I cleaned when I could. But inside me, I was no longer the same broken woman who had once sat trembling in the corner of her own home. I began to notice things I had ignored before. The sound of my son's laughter, once my favorite music, now sounded hollow, almost rehearsed. The way my daughter-in-law looked at me wasn't with annoyance anymore, but with fear, as if she sensed something had shifted. They had expected me to collapse, to give in, to fade into silence. But instead, I was standing taller, even if only in spirit. One morning, I opened the small wooden box I keep under my bed. Inside were my husband's old letters, my wedding bangles, and folded carefully at the bottom, the deed to this house. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, tracing the signatures with my finger. I remembered the day I had signed it over to my son, my heart full of trust, my eyes full of love. That day, I thought I was giving him security, a future. But now, looking at it again, I realized something important. Love should never require you to erase yourself completely. I whispered to my husband's photograph. I kept your promise. I gave him everything. But now, I must protect what little is left of me. That was the first day I allowed myself to act, not in anger, but in quiet determination. I dressed in my best shawl, the one embroidered with golden thread, and walked to the lawyer's office. My steps were slow, my back slightly bent, but inside I felt taller than I had in years. Every step was a reminder to myself, I still have worth. I still have power. The lawyer was a kind man, much younger than me, with eyes full of curiosity. When I explained my situation, his face softened. He spoke gently but firmly, guiding me through the papers, explaining what I could do to ensure that my home, my only shelter, my last treasure, would remain mine. It wasn't easy. My hands shook as I signed, but I did it. For once, I wasn't signing away my life. I was reclaiming it. As I walked home, the sky above me seemed brighter, though the sun was the same as it had always been. I realized something then. My worth was never in the way others treated me. My worth was in the life I had lived, the love I had given, and the strength I was finding again. That evening, I sat at the dining table. My son and his wife were there, talking, barely acknowledging me. But I sat differently that night, not hunched, not shrinking. I sat upright, my shawl draped proudly, my eyes steady. They didn't notice, of course. They had no idea that something inside me had changed forever. And maybe that was the most powerful part. They didn't need to know. My dignity wasn't theirs to give or take. It was mine. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The ache in my chest hadn't vanished, but it had softened, replaced with something new. Hope. I knew now that no matter what happened, I would not allow myself to be discarded. I was no longer the silent shadow in their house. I was a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had sacrificed, and who had the right to stand tall, even in the final chapters of her life. And in that quiet strength, I found freedom. I wake up these days to the sound of silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness that once pressed down on my chest, but a lighter one, a silence that feels like a companion. The birds outside my window sing softly in the early morning, and I often sit by the wooden chair near the curtain, sipping tea slowly, watching the steam rise and dissolve into the air. This house, my house, feels different now. It no longer feels like a place where I am invisible. It feels like a place where I breathe freely again. Taking back the deed was not about money or property. It was about dignity. It was about reminding myself that I had not lived 70 years only to be discarded like an old piece of furniture. And though my heart still aches when I remember the voices I overheard that night, my own son planning a life without me, it no longer breaks me. It strengthens me oddly, because now I know I survived what I once thought I could not. Some evenings, I walk slowly through the hallways, my hand brushing against the walls where my children once ran, leaving fingerprints, laughter echoing against these very same bricks. I pause near the family photographs, some fading, some still sharp. There's a picture of my son as a little boy, sitting on my lap, holding my hand with such trust in his tiny fingers. Sometimes I wonder, does he remember that version of himself? Does he remember the mother who sat awake through his fevers, who fasted and prayed for his exams, who gave up her own dreams so he could chase his? I don't know. Perhaps he has forgotten. But I have not. Those memories are stitched into me, like a quilt of love and sacrifice, impossible to unpick. My son still lives in this house. After I reclaimed the deed, I did not throw him out. I am his mother. No matter what happened, that bond cannot be erased so easily. But things are different now. We speak less, and when we do, our conversations are careful, measured, almost fragile, like porcelain cups you don't want to break. His wife looks at me sometimes with eyes that cannot hide her resentment, but I do not return her anger. I greet her politely, share the dining table when I must, and then retreat into my room. You may wonder, did he ever apologize? Did he ever look me in the eye and admit his mistake? The truth is, no, not fully. He has said small things, here and there, words that sound like regret, but are never shaped into an apology. Perhaps his pride does not allow it. Perhaps his guilt does not know how to speak. But I have learned not to wait for his words. My healing does not depend on his remorse. Still, there are moments, little ones, that feel like cracks in the wall between us. Sometimes, when he thinks I am not watching, I see him place his hand on the same family photograph I once held. Sometimes, I catch his eyes lingering on me, heavy with something unsaid. And though it hurts that he cannot speak it aloud, a part of me senses he knows. He knows he went too far. He knows he wounded the one person who always stood by him. I have stopped demanding, stopped expecting. My heart is tired of waiting for perfect closure. Instead, I find peace in small reconciliations. Like the evening he brought me my favorite dessert without a word, leaving it on my table. Or the time he carried my heavy basket of laundry without being asked. These gestures are not apologies, but they are something. And sometimes, something is enough to soften a wound that has been bleeding too long. But the real reconciliation, my dear, is not with him. It is with myself. For too long, I believed my worth was measured by how much I was needed, how much I was appreciated. When my sacrifices were forgotten, I thought it meant my life had lost meaning. But I see differently now. My worth is not written by my son's gratitude, or lack of it. It is written in the love I gave, the prayers I whispered, the countless acts of care no one saw but God did. Do you know what I keep on my bedside these days? A small box. Inside it are my prayer beads, a few letters my late husband once wrote to me, and an old recipe book with smudges of oil and flour. These are my treasures. They remind me of a life well lived, even if it did not end in the way I once imagined. They remind me that my story is not one of defeat, it is one of endurance. And yes, there are lonely moments still. Nights when I hear laughter from my son's room and wish I were part of it. Days when the house feels too quiet, too hollow. But I no longer crumble under that silence. I fill it with my own prayers, my own thoughts, my own resilience. I have learned to sit with myself and not feel empty. Some neighbors whisper about what happened. Word spreads in communities faster than wind. They ask me quietly, "Why did you take the house back? Was it revenge?" I only smile and say, "It was not revenge. It was survival." Because that's what it was. A mother should never have to fight for her dignity in her own home. But when she must, she should not be afraid to. And here is something I want you, yes, you who are listening to me now, to remember. No matter your age, no matter how much you've given, no matter how invisible the world may sometimes make you feel, you are not disposable. Your worth is not erased because someone else fails to see it. Your dignity is yours to hold, and no one has the right to take it away. If one day my son does come to me, truly, with a heart heavy with remorse, my arms will be open. I will forgive him. I already have, in many ways. Forgiveness is not for him. It is for me, so that bitterness does not rot my soul. But if he never comes, if he never says those words I long to hear, I will still be at peace. Because I know I stood tall when it mattered most. Now, as I sit by the window, watching the world outside change with seasons, I find myself smiling more often. My life is quieter, simpler, but also freer. I no longer live in the shadows of despair. I live in the light of self-respect. And if my story can reach even one heart, if it can whisper to one woman out there who feels unseen, unloved, or forgotten, that she too has the right to stand up, to reclaim her dignity, then perhaps everything I endured has meaning beyond myself. Because in the end, life is not only about what we lose. It is also about what we reclaim. And I have reclaimed myself. They say that time is a thief. It steals our youth, our strength, our beauty. But I have learned something far more painful. Time also steals memories. Not just our own, but sometimes the memories our children carry of us. The moments when we held their small hands, wiped their tears, cooked their favorite meals, and stood awake through long nights of fevers and fears. And when those memories fade in their hearts, a mother becomes disposable, forgotten. But let me tell you something, my dear listeners, no mother is ever truly disposable. Her worth does not vanish when her children stop seeing it. Her sacrifices do not dissolve simply because no one says thank you. Love, real love, is not erased by ingratitude. I want you to think about something with me. Close your eyes for a moment and remember your childhood. Think of the hands that buttoned your shirt when you were too small to do it. The hands that braided your hair, or tied your shoes, or spoon-fed you warm soup when you were too weak to eat. Do you see those hands? They were wrinkled even then, perhaps with the marks of hard work. Maybe they smelled faintly of cooking oil, or of soap, or even of medicine. Now imagine those hands, trembling in old age, reaching out not for thanks, but simply for kindness, and being pushed away. That image should break your heart, because it is a cruelty no mother deserves. I lived it. I carried the sting of it. I was left to feel like a burden in the very home I built with love. And yet, through it all, I discovered a truth so powerful that I must share it with you. A mother's worth is eternal. It is not bound by whether her children remember, respect, or honor her. It is bound in the very fabric of who she is, giver of life, protector, teacher, silent warrior. My story is just one thread, but there are millions like me. Mothers in quiet villages, in crowded cities, in small towns across the world, all of them holding their breath, hoping that their children will not forget them when their hair turns gray. And so, if you are listening to me right now, I ask you gently, pause. Take a moment and think of your mother, not just as Emmy, mama, mum, or mother. Think of her as a woman who once dreamed, who once sacrificed, who once gave you every drop of her strength without asking for anything in return. Ask yourself, when was the last time you called her just to hear her voice? When was the last time you said, I love you? When was the last time you looked at her not as a duty, but as a blessing? Because the truth is, we do not get forever. One day, those hands will no longer reach for you. One day, the kitchen where she cooked your favorite dish will be silent. One day, the chair where she prayed for your safety will be empty. And on that day, no amount of regret will bring her back. Do not wait for loss to remind you of love. If my journey has taught me anything, it is this: dignity and compassion are not luxuries we give our parents. They are debts we owe. Sacred debts. For every sleepless night they spent worrying over us, for every sacrifice they made silently, for every time they chose our comfort over their own, we owe them. Not with money, not with grand gestures, but with simple, enduring respect. And to those who are mothers listening to me now, hold your head high. Even if your children have forgotten, even if they have turned away, know that your worth is not diminished. You are not invisible. God sees you. The world may overlook you, but heaven counts every tear you have shed. Your quiet prayers rise higher than any ingratitude. To the daughters and sons who still have their mothers, treasure her while you can. Do not wait for her chair to be empty to realize she was your shelter. Pick up the phone today. Visit her. Hold her hand. Look into her eyes and tell her that you remember, that you honor her, that you love her. And to those whose mothers are no longer here, honor her by the way you live. Carry her lessons forward. Pass her kindness into the world. Keep her memory alive in the way you speak, in the way you raise your children, in the way you treat others. Never forget, a mother's value is not measured in convenience. It is measured in love, the kind of love that wakes up at midnight, that sacrifices quietly, that forgives endlessly. So let my story not just be a story. Let it be a mirror. If you see yourself in it, as the mother who gave everything, or as the child who might have forgotten, let today be the day you change. Because tomorrow is never promised. And when your time comes to look back on your own life, may you never have to whisper the words, I wish I had honored her more. Instead, let your heart be at peace, knowing you cherished the most sacred gift God ever placed in your life, your mother. That is the lesson I leave with you. That is the legacy every mother deserves.